Welcome to your doom.
Altered Beast. It was only a matter of time before I covered this game. Not exactly loved by all, but when looking at the history of gaming by my favourite company Sega, or as console gaming as a whole, especially during the 16-bit era, for better or worse, this game is one of the most important games of that generation. And this channel just wouldn't be worth its weight in gaming historian gold if I didn't look at exactly why that is. You want to play cutesy platformers involving princesses and miserable mushrooms? Then go over here. But if you want to go up against your parents' best wishes, playing as the reincarnated corpses of a couple of dead warriors, building up your muscles before turning into wolves, bears or dragons whilst fighting off decapitated demon heads, then this is what you want. Although, if I'm going to be honest, yeah, it's probably best you just stick with Mario, guys. But if, like me, you didn't notice what was best for you in the first place, then until that time I invite you to join me as we take a look at the complete history of Altered Beast, where we'll be looking at its creator, its rather shocking ports and sequel, the initial plan of what was going to be, and of course, the games themselves. Welcome to Slope's Game Room. For me, I got my Mega Drive not only after Altered Beast was a pack-in game, but instead when Sonic 1 was a pack-in alongside Sonic 2. In fact, my first experience with Altered Beast was actually via this. Altered Beast for the Amstrad CPC. And as I typed this script out, I realised that this is probably the same for the majority of UK listeners. You see, even though we did well with the Mega Drive here in the UK, selling approximately 30 to 40,000 units in its early months, we as a nation were still very much a home computer country through and through. And considering this game got ported more times than FIFA fans get tricked into paying full price for DLC, just like me, there's a good chance you played a port before you played the original. Heck, if we're going to get technical, even that Mega Drive / Genesis game was also a port. Which means, yep, I think we're in fact getting a little ahead of ourselves, guys. So, let's go back to the beginning. Let's start off by chatting about this guy. Once again, Makoto Ushida. I say once again because we have now covered this guy several times on the Complete History show. I'm talking Golden Axe, Nights into Dreams, Space Channel 5, Crazy Taxi. I mean, sure, he wasn't as involved with certain games in this list than others, but he did indeed provide a helping hand with all of these games, among many, many more. Ushida-san has Sega pumping through his blood, and he still works with the company to this day as the current head of Sega's Shanghai R&D division. But his role at Sega actually started all the way back in 1987. He had always been a big fan of gaming, being completely absorbed by it in fact, and even though he grew up in a neighbourhood with little to no arcade life in it, that didn't stop him biking up a mountain for an hour and a half each way to watch other people play on these arcade machines when he had no money to his name at a local ski resort. In a word, this guy was gaming obsessed. Eventually the day did come that he actually got into playing games himself, as he played classic arcade games such as Pac-Man, pretty much to perfection. Ushida-san took this whole thing very, very seriously, and in an interview with Sega Legacy he explains just how seriously he took it.
Before playing, I went to the bathroom and I made sure to have something to drink before starting my game. Once started, I could play for half an hour without making a single mistake.
Fair play. Regardless, when that time did arrive and Ushida-san found himself in the role of a playtester for Yu Suzuki's awesome Afterburner game, he obviously made a good enough impression at this point, as not long after he found himself pitching a somewhat standard beat-em-up game with a bit of a unique twist. In most games, as you make your way through, you lose health and you become weaker and weaker as the game progresses. However, he wanted to turn the whole idea on its head. He wanted you to control a muscular man from the get-go that gets more and more powerful depending on the pickups you gather throughout the game, and Sega's head liked the idea, but sadly, no teams were available to make it, and therefore, Yoshida-san went back to playtesting and of course continuing to develop his idea. The whole make the main muscular character stronger mechanic was the real driving force with this game, but the big issue for him, however, was basically just when to stop. He was trying to come up with a way of showing off what that final form would be, and after watching a couple of spooky flicks on TV, it all started to fall into place. What if that final form was not yet another muscle expanding animation, but instead a transformation of a kind of animal monster character, aka a therianthrope? Yes, that's apparently how you say that. And for those like me that just don't understand this meaning, is a term used to refer to a transformation of a human being into an animal partially or completely. Yep, just as Arnold Schwarzenegger's Conan influenced his future game Golden Axe, this game's influence actually came from such flicks as The Howling and Michael Jackson's excellent Thriller music video. As time went on, the idea for his game continued to grow, with a Greek setting infested with monstrous enemies, and before you know it, 6 months had passed before a team was finally ready and the concept of Altered Beast had been thoroughly thought through. The eventual lead programmer who'd worked on Alex Kidd and the Lost Stars headed up Team Shinobi, who had just finished, you guessed it, Shinobi, and the crew got to work turning this incredibly unique for the time game idea into an arcade game using the Sega System 16 arcade hardware as the basis, simply because of its ability to show off incredibly big sprites. From the get-go, it was that transformation idea that was the first to get nailed, which is why he ended up getting his lead artist to work on nothing but that for an entire month. It's obvious that this game was designed from a design point of view more than anything, as not only were those transformations made to grab arcade goers' attention, but so were the enemies that you actually fight in the game.
I chose beasts that would best match the environment that could reign as the most powerful existence in that world.
Obviously, with such a long time for game conception, well, for the late 80s at least, a crazy amount of ideas were implemented into the design of the game, some of which were yet again inspired by movies he saw, especially classic Harryhausen movies, and it's fair to say in retrospect that perhaps a few too many ideas were actually implemented into this game, because although the end result is a rather simple and a good amount of fun in the arcades, it lacked a whole lot of depth. Originally, each character and transformation would not only have a drastically different ability, but also different strengths too. Being that the game was all about punching and kicking your way through the game, it also was originally going to have pressure-sensitive buttons included. The harder or softer you hit, the harder or softer the attack would be. However, this obviously just didn't happen. The end result, as stated, is a fine game in the arcades at least, but with so many other similar games on the market, including Sega's own produced ones, which, let's be honest, were actually better, it sadly didn't hit it off too well in its homeland in the long run. But where some will argue that this game may fall down in gameplay and depth, it sure as hell made all of that up in its design and its style.
The best thing about making the game was that I could show my idea to everyone and surprise them. I was so thrilled when I saw not only the players, but the people around the players uniformly surprised at the video arcade.
Who knows how this game would have ended up if all those ideas were implemented? It's yet again another classic case of what if? What if this game was more than just a simple brawler with a gorgeous art style? What if this game did have more than just 5 stages? And what if this game did actually implement pressure-sensitive buttons, which if you ask me actually sounds awful? I suppose we will just never know.
Because of the lack of a pressure-sensitive sensor button, the number of character actions fell to half from the original concept, and the complexity of the game was decreased by this. As a result, players got tired of the game relatively soon.
Yeah, it's quite interesting to look at what could have been, but in all honesty, in my opinion, if the game did include these stripped out features, it would in fact possibly lose its biggest selling point, which is, of course, its charm. Sure, the game is repetitive, nobody's knocking it for that, most games in this genre were like that. But for me, when you get used to the game and, to be fair, give it some much needed trial and error, you do eventually learn the best way to play it. Its gameplay isn't groundbreaking, and even for its time it felt a little clunky and non-forgiving, but when you get used to it, you're gonna have a lot of fun. What this game has going for it in spades is its look and feel. Add this into a pretty cool transformation mechanic with each of these 5 stages looking completely unique, and you got a game that, no matter how hard or, to be honest, frustrating it may be in the first place, if you stick with it you will be left with a very memorable experience. When you beat up the enemies, their limbs fly towards the screen. You can beat the crap out of tombstones when you hear these timeless digitized voices start you off.
Rise from your grave.
And come up again when you fight your enemies. When you get pulled in by the stunning attract mode staring you out. When you hear that incredible soundtrack. And again, those transformations are to die for. Quite literally. Once transformed, each final form plays slightly different, and the only way you're going to beat the game is if you transform at the right time and stay transformed for as long as you need, basically until the final boss. Again, lots of trial and error is going to be had here, and thankfully the somewhat lackluster gameplay can be overlooked due to the game's style. Well, that was the case back in the day at least. Not so much in Japan, but definitely in America. You see, the game did well at pulling people in Japan due to the features mentioned before, but it didn't do well at keeping people involved. In America, it kinda did the same, but for whatever reason, perhaps due to the popular theming being very relatable to popular metal artists and pop culture for the time, it did a fair amount better. Good enough, in fact, to be released as a pack-in game for the new System 16 inspired video game console, the Genesis.
The technology that made home videos possible is called an N-bit system. Now SEGA has introduced Genesis, a revolutionary 16-bit system that improves gameplay opportunities, graphics, memory, and sound. This new technology made its nationwide debut in Manhattan with Donald Trump on hand as kids and parents challenged each other to SEGA's newest games, Tommy Lasorda's Baseball and Altered Beast.
I love it. I think it's great.
The best I've ever seen.
I like it. It's pretty cool.
The 16-bit microprocessor allows for enhanced graphics, more memory capability, stereo sound, depth perception, simulated 3D. You now have a game that is richly enhanced, a game that is very, very similar to that you would find in the arcade.
This conversion, although not arcade perfect, was in fact a great version of the game, and even though some reviewers, even for the time, were a little scathing with their reviews saying that the game didn't offer much to you, the player, what it did offer was an experience that no other game was able to do at the time. You see, alongside this packing game, players were able to pick up Last Battle, Space Harrier 2, Super Thunder Blade, Tommy Lasorda Baseball, and Thunder Force 2. And although Altered Beast was not the best of the bunch, it was definitely not the worst, but most importantly, it showed off the power of the system arguably more than any other of those games ever did. The Sega Genesis was coming in to take on the NES. I mean, remember, this was released a whole 2 years before the Super Nintendo, and one of its biggest selling points over the NES was its claim to bring the arcade experience home. And what better way to show it off than with this game? Because of all of this, Altered Beast has held its popularity and then some. Everyone, for better or worse, remembers this game, and Sega, with so many incredible titles that they could promote from their past, still decide to show off this alongside the top franchises that they are known for. And sure, that may sound a little bonkers to some, considering the Mega Drive is the most iconic system that Sega ever released. To me, it makes perfect sense.
When I heard that Altered Beast would be bundled with all the Sega Genesis packages in North America, I had no idea what to expect. I was working in Japan and heard about it there. I just said, "That's terrific, I can't wait to see it." But we never saw the bundle in Japan. I had to go to the US about 3 years later, and I heard about it again. So I said, this time I'll definitely go to a store. But I couldn't find it anywhere. There was nothing but the Sonic the Hedgehog bundle available, so I was never able to see it. That's my only regret about the game.
Late in the 20th century, terminal boredom fell upon the land. The maker looked down and said, "This is not good." And so it was. He brought forth Genesis, a system with twice the power, twice the challenge, twice the fun, with high-definition graphics and stereo sound. And the maker saw what he had done and said, "Now that's not bad. Discover Genesis, and your world will never be the same."
That Mega Drive port, ladies and gentlemen, in all honesty, did what it needed to do. It looked fantastic for a home console port of a stunning arcade game, and in some cases it even improved upon that arcade game with parallax scrolling, and although I find it easier, probably because I played it more, the slight change in the enemy's placement was done to actually help harden, aka lengthen the game a tad, because this is quite simply a port through and through. No bells or whistles added to this one at all, which isn't surprising because it actually only came out a few months after the arcade original. Literally, that's quick. Even though he wasn't involved himself, besides giving some advice, he was tempted to try his best to actually get those pressure-sensitive features implemented into this version of the game, but he simply ran out of time. Plus, there was actually no easy way for the Mega Drive to pull that off so early on in its life. Shortly after this, another port was made. In fact, it was actually being made at the same time for the Master System. Just like most Mega Drive games that were downgraded to work on the 8-bit system, this one obviously wasn't as good. In fact, it's pretty terrible. The game seems to have taken the faults of the original and made them far, far worse. I mean, seriously guys, this game is so slow, and then some. And even with an entire missing level, it's actually a complete chore to play. The PC Engine port isn't too bad in all honesty. I mean, the difficulty level has been ramped up a fair bit, which will help keep the game fresh for hardcore fans. And if you're lucky enough to own the PC Engine CD version, you get this nice kind of animation sequence. The only problem is the way the game feels. There seems to be this weird kind of delay that honestly will take some getting used to. Strangely enough, Sega actually published Altered Beast for the Famicom too. Who knows why, and it too is not very good at all. To be fair, it does change up the gameplay somewhat, but again it's more frustrating than anything else. And regarding home computers guys, when I knew no better, I enjoyed loading up the game on my Amstrad, and although honestly I never actually remember getting past the first level, and now when I look back, meh. That's pretty much the case throughout. The Amstrad release, although nostalgic, is barely playable at all. The Atari port is probably the best from what I've tried, and to give it its due, it does feel completely playable compared to what you would expect. The Commodore 64 version looks okay, not great, but it's at least playable. The Spectrum version is technically impressive for the system, but you'd never actually want to play it because the controls are basically impossible, and the same goes for the MSX, as it's exactly the same from what I can tell. In other words, none of these are worth it. The only real competition is between the arcade original and the Mega Drive port. Well, there is the Tiger game too, but yeah. Should we move on? Over the coming years, when Altered Beast fell into obscurity pretty quickly, not even being included in the Mega Games collections, I remember it just always sitting there in some gamer's collection, mostly by the older brother of a friend that got the system at launch that wouldn't even let us play it in the first place. Yep, as quick as it came, it was forgotten. As other brawlers flooded the market and classic ones, including games that had come out before or around the original's release, got sequels during the 16-bit era, Altered Beast got nothing. gaming. There was of course Matthew Sweet, a musician that liked the game so much that he not only owned the original arcade in his house, but also named an album after the game. I would say I will talk more about this next time, but that's kind of the whole story regarding that. Basically, the world was slowly forgetting about Zeus's resurrection and the fight against Neph. Well, that was until THQ got hold of the rights for a few games, and as you would expect with 3D6 games behind it, just like Revenge of Shinobi, they did a pretty shoddy job at rising the game from its grave. In all honesty, I mean, what did they actually have to take from? I tell you what, a crazy amount of charm and style, which this game doesn't have. Sorry to the devs on this one, but the levels are stupidly long and boring, the music is completely forgettable, and the design is this kind of digitized style that, in all honesty, made it dated as soon as it came out. The gameplay is kind of fine in all honesty, but at the same time it's as bare bones as you could possibly imagine. In my eyes, a true 2D sequel that does the name justice can still be made, and this is just not it. Leaving us with one final game to talk about, Altered Beast on the PlayStation 2, and boy, it's as forgettable as they come. The original team are back for this one, and it's sadly nothing like other SEGA 3D rebrandings for the system, again like Shinobi, because this game is not fun at all. The original team are back for this one, and it's sadly nothing like other SEGA 3D rebrandings for the system, again like Shinobi, because this game is not fun to play at all. Obviously trying to jump onto the Devil May Cry style of gameplay, which was new, fresh, and more importantly popular at the time, SEGA looked back through their classic catalogue and thought, Altered Beast? Yeah, that might work. But it didn't. Again, it's the same game by name, but not by style. You play as this guy, someone who awakes with no memory, and would you believe it, he's been experimented on. Time to fight. The game just makes you wish you was playing 50 other games that are similar, in every single instance, better. It has this fairly cool mechanic which requires you to constantly kill in order to stay transformed, and I suppose in the right instance it would work well, but in all honesty I don't really care too much. It was a sad way to go for the series, not even getting a release of the game in America, and is sadly reminiscent of a time when SEGA were at their very worst. One positive about this game's limited release, however, is that thankfully it didn't ruin its history. Entire sections of SEGA branded shops are focused on this game. It still gets ports, bloody good ones too, as found on the Mega Drive Mini, and probably even better than the original, the 3DS. Though for all of its ups and downs, as stated, Altered Beast is remembered and then some. It was never the best, but considering how much is still pushed into the face of gamers above other games, you would think it is. The classic synthesized voices, the settings, the fact that it was all just one big play at the end of the game, yes, that's how the original game ended, shows us a series that even SEGA themselves don't mind poking fun at. It's camp, it's silly, it's fun when you get used to it, and for many it showed us what the greatest system of all time was capable of, and even though it's not the best, it was the perfect first step to perfection.
It was very important for us to release Streets of Rage in the US. Remember that our strategy was to market to an older audience than Nintendo did, and Streets of Rage certainly appealed to that teen and college market. It was an action-filled game, actually constant action, easy to get into, and somewhat difficult to complete. And the great music was also really appealing to our audience. Hence, it was really important to us strategically. After it was successful, we wanted a second game, but because it had not been that successful in Japan, SEGA of Japan didn't want to do it. It took a lot of phone calls across the Pacific cajoling and begging to finally get SEGA of Japan to agree to do Streets of Rage 2. In my opinion, it was even better than the first game. Again, the fast action and music was great. It certainly was a huge and important part of our successful strategy to go after an older audience and differentiate ourselves from Nintendo.
That was Tom Kalinske, the former president and CEO of SEGA of America, arguably one of the most important people in SEGA's history, full stop. He and his team are responsible for bringing some of SEGA's most important game franchises to the forefront, and obviously, as you just heard, one of those classics was the follow-up to Streets of Rage, quite possibly the very best game on the system and the very best first-party game that SEGA ever put out. And that is one of the reasons why I plan to do this complete history one final time. My original complete history was 75 videos ago in this series, released on August 23rd, 2014. It was the third video I ever did, and honestly, I've come a long way since then. As Tom just stated, I missed out a lot in that last video, and now this is my opportunity to do it right, to do it justice. And, well, there has been one other change up since then too, hasn't there? Oh yes, Streets of Rage 4. It's not only here, but the reviews are coming in very positively. After this trailer dropped almost exactly 4 years after my complete history, I reached out to the devs to introduce myself and share my passion for this series, and one of the people that responded was none other than Cyril from Guard Crushed Games, who said,
"All the team watched your video when we started working on the project. It's great."
I have never been more proud than when I got that response. The team who worked on the latest entry in the Streets of Rage series, one of my favourites of all time, watched my history video when starting work on this excellent sequel. So to all of the fans that have supported me since then, thank you. The people that worked on this incredible game, thank you. And of course, it's up to me to go back to the beginning once again and finally do Streets of Rage, the complete history, properly. Welcome to Slope's Game Room. Back in 1984, the incredible Japanese developer Irem put out the although rather limited by today's standards but still pretty damn solid arcade game that is Spartan X. More widely known as Kung Fu Master, this martial arts game is believed by many to have unknowingly started the genre that we're going to be talking about today. This game of death and Wheels on Meals inspired game laid the groundwork for future side-scrolling beat-em-ups, and as already stated, unknowingly got so much right considering how early it was for this genre. Punching, kicking, performing these actions whilst jumping and crouching, side-scrolling your way through hordes of bad guys, all so you can defeat the boss man at the end of each stage. It was a hit in the arcades and got ported numerous times on home computers, and most notably the NES. As repetitive as this title was, there was something about it that really did grab players' attention, and as we have shown off numerous times on the Complete History show, its influence went far beyond simply moving left to right, beating wave after wave of the exact same looking enemy. As we discussed in Double Dragon The Complete History, the video game Renegade had moved the genre even further into the typical side-scrolling beat-em-up genre that we all know and love. taking the action to the streets and giving you the ability to move in 8 directions on the playing field again. This was progressed even further when Double Dragon itself was released, giving off the ability to fight your way through the waves just like Renegade, but this time with a buddy in multiplayer. By this point in 1987, it's fair to say that the side-scrolling beat-em-up genre was seriously booming. You couldn't go 5 minutes without a new title entering the streets. In fact, it got so overcrowded that the vast majority of its games just fell into the background, only to be discovered as the true greats that they were many years later. Yep, to truly stand out, you didn't just need to have a good game, you needed something more. For lack of a better word, you needed a gimmick. A lot of the time, those gimmicks are pretty obvious, such as a licensing agreement with a popular kids' TV show of the time. However, the true standout titles didn't have this luxury. They had no choice but to push their graphical capability to the limit, and one of the best examples was found in the fictional town of Metro City, with the awesome Final Fight. This game didn't do too much more than what came before it in all honesty, but what it did well. It stood out with its massive sprites and obviously all of the perfectly unoriginal traits that we all know and love by today's standards. You know, controlling stupidly strong players, fighting off stupidly dressed thugs in urban settings to save a stupidly curvaceous damsel in distress at the end of the game. Final Fight quickly made its mark, and the race to get the licensing for the title onto home consoles was won by Nintendo. Well, actually, they didn't have much choice, to be fair, with Nintendo's strict licensing agreement, and considering these were the good old days of Sega versus Nintendo, Sega was rightfully a little nervous. The Mega Drive, or Genesis if you prefer, had come out the same year as this legendary arcade title, and sure, it had a few more than worthy titles in the side-scrolling brawler genre. In its growing library, such as Golden Axe, Altered Beast and The Revenge of Shinobi, it still didn't have its urban brawler. And sure, Sega got a good year head start on the competition and even longer for the majority of the world, but there was no denying that the upcoming Super Nintendo Entertainment System getting Final Fight as an exclusive was surely going to be a pretty big punch to the gut unless they did something quick. Now, to be fair guys, this theory has been debunked a fair few times in the past, whether, Streets of Rage or Bare Knuckle if you will, was in fact influenced by Final Fight or not. And today, I want to give you all of the evidence that I can find so you can make up your own mind. You see, legendary Sega game planner Noriyoshi Oba, who originally worked on the arcade game Wonder Boy in Monster Land before creating the also legendary Revenge of Shinobi on the Mega Drive, with the extra legendary Yuzo Koshiro, we'll be talking about him later on in the video, had already started planting the seeds of creating a street brawler game of his own. He was someone who joined the company a few years prior, and before that he majored in marketing and statistics at university. Like many, Oba-san had seen the rise of the genre, and in an interview with Read Only Memory, he explains where the idea originated from.
After the development of the Super Shinobi was complete, I discussed with Yuzo Koshiro some ideas for making a street karate game. We looked at titles such as Double Dragon and Final Fight and used detective TV shows like Starsky and Hutch and The A-Team for reference. Then we proceeded to create the concept for Bare Knuckle.
With all that said, it is also worth noting that in an interview with Atsushi Siemiya, one of the artists of the eventual first game in the series, when asked if Streets of Rage was made in direct response to Final Fight, he humbly replied,
"I cannot deny that it was not."
But later stated,
"Actually, we bought a Final Fight machine and studied it a lot as a team."
One of the other team members that helped with the creation of this upcoming game was Hiroki Chino, who was one of the eventual game developers after working on the aforementioned Revenge of Shinobi and the home conversion of eSWAT. This new A-Team inspired street karate game, as he puts it, that would take on the upcoming Final Fight home release originally went under the title D-SWAT. And in case you guys are wondering, the D stood for Dragon. Yes, the original name of Streets of Rage was indeed Dragon SWAT. Not bad, eh? So, in this eSWAT follow-up, you could play as
Godhead!
who is a white karate expert from Chicago and is definitely not a cheap knockoff of Chuck Norris. This character was eventually changed to Hawk in an early beta. You've got Blackbird, a black martial arts expert from London who got a name change to Wolf in the beta. And then of course you got the necessary female entry, Pink Typhoon, who was from Hong Kong and was a master of Kung Fu believed to be inspired by Angela Mayo. Obviously changes were made, and during development all of these characters ended up getting, well, changed. Just like Sonic the Hedgehog's original design, these 3 characters and the name of the game in this instance was redesigned to suit a far more worldwide demographic. God Hand became Axel Stone, Blackbird became Adam Hunter, thank God, and Pink Typhoon became Blaze Fielding, and the name got changed to the incredible Bare Knuckle. And you want to know something really strange? Out of all of the 3 original Japanese box arts, where each game is called Bare Knuckle 1, Bare Knuckle 2 and Bare Knuckle 3, none of the characters have bare knuckles. Well, okay, Blaze kind of does in the second one, but she's got a bracelet on. You get what I'm trying to say. During the course of the game's production, and whilst Final Fight did eventually find its rather successful, albeit stripped back release on the Super Nintendo, the team was still pushing to make the best game they could for Sega's 16-bit wonder. As stated, Obasan had already proven his worth and demonstrated how far he could take games when building them from the ground up for Mega Drive owners when he took the Shinobi concept and worked out how to make it a fuller experience for the home market. In his words,
"Arcade games you enjoy for 3 minutes for 100 yen and they make you happy. On the other hand, home console games cost 5,800 yen and have to provide gameplay for many hours without making the player bored."
Never was a truer word spoken. However, this time he wasn't actually taking an already existing concept, he was creating something new from scratch. Kind of. I suppose if you want to get technical, he was actually using a heavily modified version of the Golden Axe engine, unsurprisingly, when creating this game, but still, he had a lot riding on this as his first true new game. And well, I think it's safe to say that he delivered and then some. So, with that, let's look at the 1991 release title, Streets of Rage.
This city was once a happy, peaceful place, until one day a powerful secret criminal organization took over. This vicious syndicate soon had control of the government and even the police force. The city has become a center of violence and crime where no one is safe. Amid this turmoil, a group of determined young police officers has sworn to clean up the city. Among them are Adam Hunter, Axel Stone, and Blaze Fielding. They are willing to risk anything, even their lives, on the streets of rage.
The same way a Star Wars intro sequence gives off the feels to hardcore fans' introduction, this simple wall of text leading into the introduction of our 3 playable characters almost 30 years later still gives me the chills. It takes me back to Christmas Day of 1992 and more importantly Boxing Day the day after, where we'd all go round my nan's house, who by the way had a seriously kick-ass sound system for someone her age. We took the Mega Drive with us, plugged it in. Thankfully my uncle also got a Mega Drive the same day, but not this game, brought his extra controller around and we started playing this game on the killer 35-inch living room CRT TV, and as it was a Mega Drive Model 1, we was able to plug it into that sound system too. Sorry Nan, but no Queen's speech for you today. Now for anyone that hasn't played it, you may be asking yourself, what is it about Streets of Rage that makes it just so popular? This series has become so well known that every single game in the same genre since, and even older games in retrospective sense, get compared to this series. Why is that? Well, everyone will give their own opinion on this, but if you ask me, it's simply the perfect blend of everything we wanted up to this date, released at the perfect time with, obviously, the perfect soundtrack. Streets of Rage and its sequels are the complete packages. Created for consoles from the get-go, they gave the perfect amount of variety in not only the three main characters, but also the stages themselves, from the gritty, but at the same time beautifully neon lit up first stage, into the darker and more traditional back alley streets in the next level, onto the beaches at night, over the still in development bridge, onto the slowly rocking boat, into the factory filled with its many hazards, up the lift. I mean, obviously games in this genre are nothing without a lift level, and finally onto the final stage. Mr. X's high-priced top floor, never-ending it seems, mansion level. The game simply oozes perfection. Getting to see the streets in the background on most stages, including the excellent slow reveal in the background on the lift stage, just brings back moments of looking out at the nighttime sky at night when driving home in the back of my parents' Panda, imagining that this could possibly be happening right now. Streets of Rage was intoxicating, and it's always stuck with me. The bosses are all very unique and incredibly 90s at the end of most stages, besides level 5, which is actually a reskin of Blaze. And by the way, according to Seima-san, a different 5th level boss was introduced, but for whatever reason was never included, which is believed to be the reason for the quick reskin. All of this, however, is perfect and worthy of being reasons as to why this stands out, along with the music, of course, which I will get to. But for me, the icing on this delicious cake is down to how you can control the characters, especially in multiplayer mode. Multiplayer was always a big factor for games like this, hence why this game was reviewed so highly compared to Super Nintendo's Final Fight, that sadly not only removed the character, a level, but also the ability to play in multiplayer. It was Streets of Rage that arguably took this concept and smacked it upside the head to level 11.
What I cared about most was the combat system, its strategic elements, and how it felt to play. The basic concept of the enemies is very simple. They move around in order to surround a player. So the key is for the player to move in such a way to avoid this. We developed a series of moves to enable strategic play. Jumping while holding allowed a player to vault over enemies to escape an encirclement. Throwing enabled a player to throw the enemy to either the front or the rear. The thrown enemy also had collision detection, so you could use this tactically to avoid becoming surrounded. Attacking from the back is a reverse attack that offers the player an option if quickly approached from behind. This varied combat system provided players with choice and, as such, a feeling of achievement.
Couple all of these moves in multiplayer and what you have is something that's easy to pick up and addictive to master. Upon completion of the game, you get asked to become the right-hand man of Mr. X. If you both say yes, you actually go back to level 6. If you say no, you fight Mr. X, hoping to complete the game and get the standard good ending. But in 2-player mode, if you choose different answers, you must fight each other. The winner, if that's the person that chose yes, then gets asked again. Again, if you say yes, you go back a couple of stages, but if you say no, you now have to fight him. You are now on the way to the bad ending with the haunting music and the still image of whoever you chose to play as with the text, "You became the boss, you are great." As expected, the game sold gangbusters and has been ported more times than I care to cover, with the Sega Ages release on the 3DS as always being the best. But honestly, pick up 99% of consoles released since Sega's console run and chances are it's been ported to them. However, in regards to proper ports, the surprisingly impressive Java game that came out in 2008 is worth mentioning, simply because it captures the game pretty well. Granted, it plays like crap, but still quite a nice addition if you ask me. Then more famously, you have the Master System version of the game, which does an admirable job of recreating the original. Sadly, it loses its 2-player co-op and you do have one boss that's mixed up compared to the original release, but overall, it's not that bad. In fact, I actually remember really enjoying this release as a kid around my neighbour's house back in the day. Surprisingly, Streets of Rage for the Game Gear is a different port than the Master System, and this one does support co-op, via a link cable of course. Sadly, a good chunk of the levels are missing here and a few of the bosses have been mixed up too, but I gotta say, it really wasn't too bad to experience either, and they kept the music sounding really good considering the hardware that they were using. And well, I suppose now is the perfect time to talk about that soundtrack. The Streets of Rage soundtrack was produced by legendary music composer Yuzo Koshiro, a musician that originally had lessons from acclaimed film composer Joe Hisaishi, who would later go on to work for Studio Ghibli, among others. His influence in his early days were based on such video game soundtracks as Space Harrier and Gradius, to name a few, and by using an NEC PC8801 as a hobby, he would attempt to recreate these tracks himself. Originally, the idea for Bare Knuckle was to create a heavy rock-based chiptune album, which was very typical for other games in the genre, but after visiting LA in the late 80s, he had discovered a much more upbeat electro-pop sound which worked perfectly with what he was creating on the PC88 at home, with his uniquely tailored software. By the time the 90s had rolled round, Yuzo Koshiro could often be found in clubs listening to a lot of that classic house music that was all of the rage back then, from the likes of Technotronic and Milli Vanilli, among others. He wanted to inject high energy music into the game itself, and when he tried adding this early 90s big beat house sound, it just fit perfectly. In his own words,
"For Bare Knuckle I used the PC88 and an original programming language I developed myself. The original was called MML, Music Macro Language. It is based on NEC's BASIC program, but I modified it heavily. It was more a BASIC style language at first, but I modified it to be something more like assembly. I called it Music Love. I used it for all the Bare Knuckle games. Once I tried house music, it all clicked, and I thought it sounded really cool."
Yes, it did. Although from time to time these tracks were a little too close to comfort to the tracks he took inspiration from.
Pump up the jam, pump it up while your feet are stumping. And the jam is bumping, look ahead, the crowd is jumping. Pump it up a little more, get the party going on the dance floor. See, 'cause that's where the party's at, and you'll find out if you do that.
But yeah, I think we can forgive him. After all, if you saw Yuzo Koshiro's name on the title screen of a game that you was about to play, you knew you was gonna have a great time. And for all of you people out there wondering, why is Yuzo Koshiro's name on the title screen? Why isn't it like the game designer or the producer or someone like that? Well, it's because his mum rang Sega and made them do it. That's a true story, by the way, guys. Anyway, on to Streets of Rage 2. So far in the episode, we discovered why the original game existed. It's popular opinion today as to which is the better game, but back then, if you only knew kids that had the same system, then you wouldn't even know that this battle of the beat-em-ups even existed in the first place. All that mattered to us Sega fans was that this was an incredible game, one of the best, a game that deserves multiple playthroughs with each character, and a game that constantly got brought out when friends of all ages came to visit. I remember it being one of the first games that I got that my parents were excited to show off as well as me. No matter who it was, as soon as you put that controller into someone's hand, anybody's hands, the game just clicked. And sure, I remember plenty of times back in my Amstrad days when my mum would come home from the chemists or newsagents with some random game for me that cost her no more than a couple of quid. Seriously guys, for anyone that's too young to remember or not living in the UK, this is how it was back in the day. All of this changed of course when I got my Mega Drive due to the price of the games. But from what I can remember, Streets of Rage 2 was the first ever game that my parents purchased, for me, completely out of the blue, and I think it will come to the surprise of nobody when I say it was obviously a very worthwhile purchase. The game was put into play pretty much straight after the launch of the original game. Yuzo Koshiro had really gone above and beyond and had built up quite the reputation at Sega, which was a good thing, as he had started to show an interest in creating his own game. His family already had their own development studio in place called Ancient, headed up by his mother with his sister doing artwork, and one of the team's first jobs was to create a port of the original Sonic the Hedgehog game onto the 8-bit Master System. This was obviously no small feat as the game was perfectly designed for the system it originated on, but for anybody out there that's ever played this Master System title, I think we can all agree that it is actually a really good spin-off to the main trilogy, and Knuckles of course. Ancient had proved themselves tremendously with this title, as did another company known as MNM Software, who were another freelance studio created by Michikito Ikawa, who had not only worked on the previously mentioned ports of Streets of Rage for the Master System and Game Gear, but also the always overlooked but still great GG Shinobi game for the Game Gear and eventually its sequel too. Yuzo Koshiro had built up the contacts with the top dogs at Sega due to that reputation, and had introduced Ichikawa-san to the boss men too, and he too discovered how interested he was in creating a game of his own. At first, Bare Knuckle 2 wasn't the chosen game for the duo, but that's when Sega of America stepped in. It's been documented several times that Sega of America and Sega of Japan butted heads throughout the golden years of the company, and apparently Sega of Japan did not have too much of an interest in creating a sequel to Bare Knuckle at all in the first place. Thankfully for us, Tom Kalinske, the head of Sega of America at the time, and his team did want it made, and they heavily went against the idea, pushing the importance of the series in Western markets, which is why Sega of Japan put 2 and 2 together and decided to let those third-party companies merge up that already had experience with the first title and its ports to let them continue on with the series with Bare Knuckle 2. The collaborative planning of the sequel started shortly after, and apparently only lasted about a week. And before going ahead, it's worth noting that Ichikawa-san did not enjoy the original game. He saw it as nothing more than
a Final Fight clone.
And although I am sure we would all scoff at such a terrible remark, he's kinda not wrong. That was the initial idea for the game. Yes, it's better, but when looking at it compared to its sequel, it is indeed a little bit bare bones. His job was to find ways to improve upon the original in every way, and to make it feel more like a uniquely branded product rather than a copycat. Thankfully, the sales of the original was so good that Sega was more than happy to bump up the production of Bare Knuckle 2 by offering the team the ability to create the game on a 16 megabit cartridge, which by the way is 4 times the size of the original game, giving them more flexibility this time round to achieve their goals. One of the team that took this in full stride was Yuzo Koshiro's own sister, Ayano Koshiro, who would create these incredibly detailed sprites in record speeds according to Ishikawa-san. She was also the artist responsible for newcomers like Max and Sammy, better known as Skate to us Western folk, which she worked on from the ground up. But on the flip side, folks, she was also the main person responsible for the loss of Adam from the first game. The idea was that if they were going to add new and exciting moves to this title, adding new characters would be the best and easiest way to go about doing it. And as these sprites were so much bigger this time round, they decided to go with characters that would be as different as possible to Axel and Blaze.
Adam had to be put aside, but we did have him appear in the story. We thought, since he's not here anymore, maybe Axel and Blaze have to go rescue him? From there, we got the idea for his younger brother, Sammy. He was going to be the super maneuverable, tricky style character. Using him requires some skill. We designed him as a character who experienced players would want to try. As for Max, he's the power style. My brother Yuzo loves throw-based characters. You know, the characters who are hard to use, but when you connect, it's over with just one hit. That roster seemed like a good balance to us. 2 standard style characters and 2 with quirks.
Together, they managed to build upon the world that the original teased us with by providing a genuine attachment to the characters, especially during the 90s, with Blaze's hobby apparently being lambada dancing, which was all of the rage at the time, and how Sammy got changed from roller skates to roller blades, cause, you know, it was the 90s, dude! The team would compile cutouts from magazines and stick them up to help capture the style that they was going for when creating the game, and I think it's shown off splendidly throughout the entire playthrough, and not just in the characters themselves. These were not just the same levels we'd seen a million times before, these were locations that required genuine imagination. The way enemies interacted with the surroundings, the way certain levels, scenarios would change completely throughout the same stage was exciting to discover, more so than ever before in any beat 'em up.
The biggest influence on that stage progression was probably the Contra series. Each stage in Contra is like, whoa, and gives a sense of a backstory to the game. It's not conveyed in words, of course, but I think you get a sense of it just from the stage progression.
Every single stage gave you something exciting to remember, whether it was the diagonal path on the first stage, the motorbikes from stage 2, the pirate ship from stage 3, or the alien-inspired theming of stage 4. The team wanted to keep you surprised, and they did this by taking inspiration from a very well-respected series. Sadly, midway through its development after that initial planning stage, NMN's main guy, Mikito Ishikawa, came down with a terrible illness that pretty much stopped his involvement on the game from here on out. The illness left him bedbound for an entire year, and he was only given a year and a half left to live. Not only did this stop his further involvements with Streets of Rage 2, but it closed the doors at NMN for a short time as well. Thankfully, he did make a full recovery a good while later and has since continued to work in the industry. However, during those days working on Streets of Rage 2, besides his excellent additions to the planning stages, both he and Yuzo Koshiro played the early builds of the game a lot during production, and thanks to this they developed a great relationship and understanding not only of the 4 main characters, but also the world found in the game too, which obviously helped tremendously when composing the soundtrack. This is why each track is not just great to listen to, but it reminds you of the settings during that particular moment in the game. Each track fitted each environment perfectly, and it really is one of the best, if not the best, examples of a 16-bit game soundtrack working alongside awesome gameplay and graphics. Koshiro-san's classic jazzy house and electro beats were still here, but with the help of his old school friend Motohiro Kawashima, they decided to go down a slightly more hardcore route than what was showcased before. By this point, techno music had well and truly started filling the airwaves, gaining its pretty sizable following, and these two were very much into the scene, visiting even more local clubs such as Space Lab Yellow and recreating the music they liked the most back home for the Mega Drive with some friendly competition was what drove the title to sound the way it did. And again, just like the first game perhaps, they copied a little bit too much.
Yes, the rhythm, the rebel, without a pause, I'm lowering my level. The hard rhymer, we can never been them in. You want styling, you know it's time to get deep.
Yes, I think we can forgive them again. And yes guys, I got both of these incredible soundtracks signed by the man himself, Yuzo Koshiro, when I went to an event up in London and watched them play this live. Oh, what an awesome night. Thank you very much, Datadiscs, for everything you've done for the Streets of Rage franchise. It's incredible, absolutely incredible. Jamie Cook, the head at Datadiscs, puts into terms better than I ever could why the Streets of Rage 2 soundtrack is so memorable.
The music in Streets of Rage 2 is the product of a creative individual who was given the freedom to experiment. He was given the space to develop ingenious methods of drawing sounds from extremely restrictive hardware and achieved something truly special. Streets of Rage 2 is the product of one man's fascination with Western dance music, something very rare in Japan at the time, filtered through an Eastern perspective and squashed through a YM2612 sound chip. It really is one of the towering achievements of the 16-bit era.
The game is simply the perfect sequel, and it stands in most people's top 3 games for Sega's 16-bit wonder. Everything that was added made sense, as well as everything that was removed. Gone was the lone cop car that would shower the screen with fire that for some reason only hurts the enemies, as now we have a new special power move that loses a small percentage of your life in exchange for a powerful and pretty much unbeatable attack. This was put in place to help continue to make Streets of Rage 2 stand out from the competition, and several other movesets were added to the existing and new characters that you quickly discover whilst playing the game can be a tad more complex compared to what was on the market before. Of course, these moves are now most notable in the all-new one-on-one mode, which, by the way, may have taken inspiration from another upcoming game that the team were pretty sure was going to be a big hit.
At an early stage, we were already convinced that Street Fighter would be popular. Therefore, we were sure that if we added Street Fighter-style special moves to Streets of Rage, the rhythm of the gameplay would improve.
These new stages would often get discussed in gatherings between the team and then quickly implemented on the spot to see if they worked. This helped get every single person closely involved, and they all agree that this was the reason that the game is still to this day the full package. Released in 1992 and early next year for Japan and us European folk, yes, Americans got there first, the game was an instant hit and has since been released consistently since then and has obviously become one of the Genesis's most standout titles, only surpassed by such titles as Sonic the Hedgehog and, I don't know, what, Aladdin? Everybody owns this game, and for good reason. Not only was it good, getting great reviews, but Sega America slapped it in front of everybody's face as best they could. You had comic strips appearing in Sonic the Comic, a Tiger LCD game had not long been out by this point, and of course, in true Sega fashion, you had the aggressive advertising campaign that was 30 seconds long this time, double the time spent on advertisements compared to what they were normally forking out. But then again, this could be because originally, Sega of America wanted to literally blow up a derelict building to promote Streets of Rage 2. That's another true story, guys.
Young Bobby Engels has a problem. He needs to earn the respect of his peers. So he gets the special SEGA Genesis fighting system. It comes with Streets of Rage 2. He saves $40. He gets more moves. He gets more control. Now things are pretty much okay.
I said chocolate chip. Say it. Say it. SEGA!
Where do we start?
How about his knee?
That's his face. If that's his face, what's this?
Mega Drive から世直しげんこつアクションベアナック2
Just like before, this game got ported to both the Master System and Game Gear 2, and just like before, again, both versions play differently to each other. It's surprising how good the Game Gear version holds up considering the limitations, and just like the game that came before it, it's a stripped back version of the original, but it's still solid enough to play. A simple yet rewarding experience for the hardcore Streets of Rage fans among you. And the Master System version, well, that wasn't very enjoyable at all. The original was a conversion of a simple game, and this is a conversion of a game that had no right being on the Master System. It's hard to listen to, it's hard and most of the time frustrating to play, and as far as Mega Drive conversions go, this is one of my least favourites. Anyway, on to number 3. How do you do it? How do you make another game in the Streets of Rage franchise that's going to make the big leap that number 2 did from number 1? In most people's eyes, you can't. You see, from the get-go, straight off the bat, Streets of Rage 3 and Bare Knuckle 3 are very, very different games. You have no doubt heard this multiple times, with Bare Knuckle 3 being the better title, and we'll get to why that is shortly. But first, let's look at what Sega was like during the release of this title that was released during the middle of 1994. The Mega CD, the soon-to-be released 32X, and Sega Saturn had been filling the pages of every single Sega-related magazine and even promotional material found in the games too. Everyone's eyes were pointing to the world of crappy polygons over perfectly refined pixel art styled games, and honestly, as hardcore of a Sega fan as I was, the release of Streets of Rage 3, which should have been right at the top of my want list, quite literally, wasn't. I had no idea this game was coming out, and by the time I did, I already had myself a PlayStation 1 and I tried Streets of Rage 3 at a friend's house. The impression it left was meh. Look, guys, it's not bad, and looking back, it was definitely better than some of the games I was playing at the time on the PlayStation 1, that's for sure. But considering the original's job was to show what Sega could do against Final Fight, and the sequel was to bring further life to the franchise at the height of the Mega Drive's popularity, this third title didn't really have a purpose. And when looking at it from afar, as stated, it didn't exactly have a big jump like the first two did, even if it was on a 24 meg cartridge this time. So you're probably thinking, what was the point? Well, if you ask me, Bare Knuckle 3 was the game that was made for the hardcore gaming brawler. You see, where some gamers may look at titles such as Counter-Strike or the Diablo series, if you will, as games that are made for a hardcore audience, it was titles such as Bare Knuckle that were being played by Japanese hardcore gamers in 1994 especially, considering arcades and even some home consoles that had moved to a more 3D based gaming style. Sure, 2D sprite-based brawlers did exist, but the dedicated fans that played them were much smaller and far more hardcore than they was before. Couple this gamer mentality with the desire to make the title stand out over its predecessor, and I think it gives a good indication as to what the team was trying to achieve with Bare Knuckle 3. The second game was so perfectly loved, they didn't want to change up the look of the game too much, but instead they wanted to expand it. The result, in Japan at least, is a title with an added storyline, an extremely hardcore techno and sometimes gabber-infused soundtrack, robotic characters that electrocute enemies, an unlockable kangaroo, and of course a flamboyant gay guy. At first, like many, I couldn't believe what they had done to my beloved series, but as time goes on, you begin to admire it. This is actually a worthy follow-up, guys, that makes enough changes to make it stand out from the pack. It's not to everyone's taste, I'm pretty sure everyone will prefer the original too, but put the time in and what you have is actually a very rewarding game, again, for the Japanese market. It's a lot shorter than before. Just like the first, it brings back not only multiple endings, but also branching paths throughout the game too. And even though it's going to be hard to get to those stages, if you are the right sort of gamer, when you do, you genuinely feel like this game was made for you. You got extra tricks that feel a little bit harder to pull off unless you got a 6-button controller. The entire game is a lot more grittier than before, losing a lot of its neon charm from the originals, and unlike the originals, it's not very pick up and play at all. Both Yuzo Koshiro and Motohiro Kawashima were back again to score the soundtrack, and by this point the competitive nature between the two was pushing them to create something that kinda stayed true to the original, but at the same time injected it with so much energy as humanly possible. To many, the end result is an absolute mess. Even the crew at Ancient voiced their concerns, the duo regarding it, with Yuzo simply responding,
"This should be fun."
And although at the time it caused a lot of controversy, in more recent years is looked at by the fans as one of the most impressive, well before its time, and experimental soundtracks, not just of the 16-bit era, but of all time. FactMag.org actually compliments the soundtrack upon its release of the Data Disc vinyl soundtrack, stating that it blends innovative, generative programming with serious techno innovation and accidentally preempted trance.
We were trying to push the limits of game music. Both Koshiro-san and I had this question in our minds of what we could do with game music. We both decided we would try to do the most difficult thing in the sense of normal music, like where you start to ask yourself if something is even music. Underground Resistance and Jeff Mills definitely have these points, like playing the same sound over and over or warping sounds, making things super noisy. They made music that would question whether what you were hearing was even fit to be called music. The 90s was a really experimental time for club music. Experimental in the big sense, but also in that there were a lot of experiments going on within the music. I think we shared an interest in seeing what would happen if we took those kinds of experiments and put them into game music.
So in summary, this is the hardcore Streets of Rage that's the hardest to master. It actually has the most replayability of any game up to this point. It's the first time in the series that you can actually unlock characters if you know how, and it probably has the most depth too. Depending on the difficulty level, the game can be different lengths, and even then the branching pathways make the title probably the most rewarding entry in the series when you finally figure them out. Sure, it doesn't have the charm or the character that the first two did, but I actually think that's what makes it so good. It has a noticeably harsher and grittier colour palette. It's not for everyone, but give it a chance once you've played the others, because once you do, the rewards speak for themselves. But that's Bare Knuckle 3 and not Streets of Rage 3. You've heard it a million times, Bare Knuckle 3 is far superior to Streets of Rage 3, and now I'm going to explain why. Honestly, there is just so much changed here, starting as soon as you turn it on. That lovely intro scene where Axel smashes the screen is missing for some reason, and it's believed that it was probably due to closer resemblance to Rambo. When characters play each other in the battle mode in the Japanese version, they end the match with a little bit of banter to each other. That was removed. Thankfully, they did fix the spelling mistake, mind you. The story has been severely cut down and censored compared to before. The voices change when you pull up your special attacks.
Bare Knuckle.
For some strange reason, the Western version decided that changing the colour of all the main characters was a good idea from the iconic colour scheme to a brand new one. Plenty of censorship throughout, as seen on the ladies you fight, as during the game they're wearing leggings instead of having bare legs, and most notably the complete removal of the overly flamboyant homosexually stereotypical character Ash, which you can actually unlock to play as yourself in the Japanese release. And besides this, you have a crazy amount of small tweaks too that just completely change the way the game feels. Certain characters can now jump higher than others, certain attacks do twice as much damage. When performing a special attack in the Japanese release, you lose a significantly more amount of life. The life bars on the enemies vary between regions, and the biggest change to the gameplay comes from the bosses. You see, the game is significantly shorter than the previous two entries if you fight on easy mode, and therefore it's believed that the heads of SEGA America were worried that the game was just too easy, and therefore gave several extra life bars to each boss in the Western release, stopping gamers from renting, returning, and ultimately never buying Streets of Rage 3. In hindsight, for someone like me, the changes are actually great, as they ended up making the two games very different and quite interesting to go back and experience. And nowadays, SEGA thankfully completely acknowledge these changes by adding both versions in later released compilations. It's worth playing both, but of course, what you have heard is completely true. Bare Knuckle 3 completely wipes the floor of Streets of Rage 3. But still, I suggest you try them both. Over the next decade or so, nothing really happened for the Streets of Rage franchise besides the original game constantly popping up on compilations. However, during this period, endless attempts to bring the franchise back would be going on behind the scenes. But obviously, in every single instance, nothing ever come from these concepts. Firstly, SEGA went to Core Design, who were most well known for the eventual Tomb Raider series, to change the in-development game Judgment Force into Streets of Rage 3. But due to unknowing issues with the developer, this partnership ended and it became the semi-popular Fighting Force game. Plenty of screenshots and gameplay of this prototype can be found online, and it shows that none of the original team were anywhere to be seen. The Dreamcast was where the next failed attempt was seen, and this time they went back to their roots, getting Ancient, now known as Overworks, involved once again. But besides a few concept videos and a supposed short playable area, the reason for the cancellation was that SEGA of America did not see the importance of the franchise. Games such as Fighting Force, among others, had proven that the world was no longer interested in this genre, and therefore they saw no reason to continue working on a game that in their eyes wouldn't gain any kind of financial return. This put the game development in a limbo-like state that it would never recover from. Not long after this, SEGA left the home console market and began creating content for the competition. With so many IPs under their belt, they ran a poll on their website asking fans to vote on what franchise they would like to see return from the dead the most. Streets of Rage came in second behind Nights into Dreams, which obviously did get a sequel on the Wii, but before that, Sega went to third-party studio Bottle Rocket Entertainment, and a new game idea began for both PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, with Marvel Comics legend Roger Robinson involved in creating brand new concepts for the game. But for unknown reasons, this version was scrapped too, with Bottle Rocket Entertainment eventually going under. In 2010, the head of Sega for the time stated in an interview that a new game was being considered using the Condemned engine. All we know is that this would have been a sandbox type game, but of course it never went any further than this. In 2012, Game Studio Grimm were also having a stab at the Streets of Rage franchise. All we have are screenshots and concept art again, before that was cancelled, and later that same year, Ruffian Games were also discovered to be making a game with real footage being discovered this time too, before obviously that was eventually cancelled for unknown reasons. Which just leaves Backbone Entertainment's attempt at bringing the franchise back with only 4 pieces of concept art being found. Thankfully for the fans, while Sega constantly fell over themselves trying to bring this awesome series back, it was the fans that took matters into their own hands with Beats of Rage. This title was pumped out in November of 2003, a game developed in 9 months by Senile Team. Even though the devs behind this homage to the Streets of Rage series using King of the Fighters sprites didn't actively promote the title, the fans did. By 2006, not only had it been downloaded over 1 million times, but it had been ported multiple times to work on many consoles. In fact, I even remember downloading this and playing it on my Dreamcast back in the day. Although by the time I did this, I think I was controlling a Marvel character. Possibly X-Men characters if I remember correctly. You see, not only did this fan hack prove that fans still did indeed want a new Streets of Rage game, but it also showcased just how nostalgic retro gamers were for the genre as a whole, as they created endless variations using the open Beats of Rage engine that the Senile Team put out.
You should know that we made it just for fun. We never thought that more than 10 people would ever play it.
As stated, the game proved very popular online when it was released, as that very same year, Bomber Games started working on their own release called Streets of Rage Remake. You see, this wasn't a new title, it was a remake that some people believe is the ultimate version of all 3 games, as it includes advancements to all of the characters, extra characters, and more modifications that you would ever know what to do with. Personally, I prefer the originals, as the restrictions actually help it become a more refined game, but there is no denying that this is still an incredible homage to one of the greatest trilogies ever made. It was reworked constantly until its final release back in 2011, with over 100 stages, 19 playable characters, 64 enemies, and a full 76-song soundtrack. Sadly, 2 days after its release online, Sega sent a takedown notice to Bomber Games requesting the removal of the title.
Sega is committed to supporting any fans that take an interest in our games, and where possible, we do so by involving them in beta tests and other development, marketing or research opportunities. However, we need to protect our intellectual property rights, and this may result in us requesting that our fans remove online imagery, videos or games in some instances.
It was obviously sad that this happened, but at the same time, without trying to start too much of a war in my comment section, you can see why. This wasn't a new game, it was a full-on remake of not 1 but 3 games, and considering it was released in its final form 17 years after the last proper release, it was released right in the middle of Sega pumping out iPhone ports of the original games.
Sega have contacted me regarding the download hosted on this site. While this issue is being resolved, please do not upload the game for others to download. Any links posted on this site will be removed. It does not use reverse engineering nor a single line of code from the original games. It's all based on visual interpretation.
Be that as it may, it's literally the same game. I'm not taking anything away from it. It is quite literally a superb title with more meat on the bone than an all-you-can-eat steakhouse. But I'm pretty sure I'm not alone when I'm saying remaking 3 of Sega's most beloved titles and giving them away for free whilst they was trying to sell the originals themselves. Come on, even if they wasn't working on a sequel, it makes sense from a business point of view, right? Well, anyway, moving on with our Streets of Rage timeline, we get to August the 23rd, 2014, with the release of this particular video right here. Yes, my first ever complete history, where I stated the following. One day I do believe they will make a Streets of Rage 4, although please don't let it be called this. And when that time comes, feel free to come back to this video and click here for my full review on that game. Besides the embarrassing voiceover of my older videos, I was right. Ladies and gentlemen, it's happened. On the 30th of April 2020, .mu, with permission from Sega, published Guard Crush Games and Lizard Cube's excellently developed title, Streets of Rage 4. Now you may be asking why I didn't want it to be called Streets of Rage 4. Well, that's because I was scared. The original trilogy of games are some of the very best ever released, and by calling it 4, no matter how good it is a closer part of the original series than it probably has any right to be. Well, it's here and it is called Streets of Rage 4. The big question is it better than Streets of Rage 2? No. But I have changed my mind now on the whole number 4 thing, because Streets of Rage 4 is indeed a very, very worthy title that I think does the name justice. Lizard Cube had already worked on the excellent Wonder Boy The Dragon's Trap game, which in case you don't know is quite literally as perfect of a remake as one can get, before working on this one. With this excellent title in hand, it started development back in 2018 after the team watched my original upload. Oh my god, I could cry with excitement, thank you all so much. Lizard Cube got to work using a modified game engine of a game created by Guard Crush Games called Streets of Fury. The game features not only nods to the original game literally all the way to the final level, but possibly more important was the team's idea of adding elements to the title that Ancient were unable to add the first time round. As an example, in the first stage of Streets of Rage 2, a car was going to smash into the wall, which you do see in its final state, just how Koshiro-san and his family wanted originally. And it's in this game. Not only does it provide a nice homage, but it shows that the team behind the game did their homework. This same innovation can be seen in the artwork, which may be a little hard to swallow for pixel heavy hardcore fans, but in Lizard Cube's eyes, this style was what would have been done the first time round if the technology was available back then.
Most of the games from the 90s which have a black outline in pixels try to reproduce animation, I believe. In some ways, if there hadn't been the pixel art technique, which was a technical limitation at the time, I think they would have tried to have this animated film feel, those very manga-like strokes and lines. Lines have been a bit forgotten. They're very important and I like those lines. We lost them a bit with 3D and with current techniques, but I think that the fact that you see them again here is also a tribute to what they were doing at the time. Personally, I love pixel art, and I know that the look, the feel that you get from pixel art, and that kind of grainy pixel art which is specific to Streets of Rage, it's quite difficult to recreate, but it doesn't mean that we have gone against it by trying to take it in another direction, while still respecting the style, the colours and the characters. I believe that it has allowed us to add a whole range of things that were not necessarily possible with pixel art.
But it doesn't matter because you can actually unlock all of the old characters in this new game anyway. As stated, I still prefer Streets of Rage 2, and I don't mind admitting that it's mostly down to nostalgia. It's the perfect length, it has the perfect difficulty curve, the perfect style, the perfect soundtrack. There's no denying it's a 10 out of 10 game. Streets of Rage 4 is a worthy follow-up, which does make some changes that even I will admit are improvements to the original, but at the same time there are a few tiny additions that were a little bit head-scratchy. For instance, the game is a tad bit longer, That's a good thing until you realise you can get to the end of a couple of the later stages in less than 5 minutes, boss and all, whereas earlier levels are the more standard Streets of Rage fare. Changing the pickup item to a different button than the punch button does indeed stop that annoying cycle of constantly trying to fight someone but instead finding yourself picking up and putting down a weapon. The problem is now that they've changed it to the same button as throwing a weapon, which means 99% of the time I chuck away my weapon in order to pick up an apple or a big bag of cash. Several bosses seem tough, which isn't a bad thing, however later bosses can be quite easy. In fact, I was able to defeat the final enemy in the game using Axel from the original Streets of Rage just by using my cop car special a couple of times. With all that said, I have put a serious amount of time into the game already, and the benefits such as the combo system, the heavy emphasis on points, the ability to chuck and catch your weapons, online play for 2, couch co-op for 4, endless amounts of nods to the originals, new soundtrack with the ability to unlock the older soundtrack, which includes the Master System versions too, by the way, makes this game more than worthy. There is a lot of meat on the bone with this title, and even if you are not somebody like me, you will end up finding yourself constantly replaying it with different characters until you unlock all of them. It's been so long since the last entry, so long in fact that many fans such as myself have all been dreaming about what the next entry would be like and if we would ever get one. Sadly, that leaves Streets of Rage 4 with the impossible task of pleasing everybody. However, put those opinions aside, people. And what you have is a game that actually is slightly better than what you would have imagined yourself. I've got myself the limited run release on order, and I can guarantee that this is a title that I will continue to play for many, many years to come. And thankfully, that does mean it's safe to say that the Streets of Rage name still stands as the leader of the side-scrolling brawler genre. Wow, what a series, guys, and what a time to be alive. It's great to see classic franchises treated as well as this, so that the hardcore fans that have made it so far into this video all about this series can come together and continue to build those perfect memories with this legendary series of games. Sega fans, these are the games that define why we love the systems we do. Playing as Axel, Adam, Blaze, Max, Skate, Zan, Cherry, Shiva, Rue, Floyd, Mr. X, Electra, Rudra, or Ash if you fancy, have resulted in the absolute best times with my mates, chucking back a few beers and attempting to beat the games on Mania mode, which I'm still trying to do. And it looks like plenty more nights like this will continue for many, many years to come, thanks to Streets of Rage.
Streets of Rage was and remains an important part of Sega's gaming history. From the original game to the new Streets of Rage 4, players around the world have loved the relentless action. Like Sonic, the second game in the series was a beloved masterpiece, but it almost never came to be. The original game underperformed in Japan, and it was felt that a sequel wasn't needed. The situation in the US was much different, where Streets of Rage was a major hit, and we were relying on a sequel for a major part of our sales volume. A lot of back and forth phone calls were made, and numerous faxes flew across the Pacific to finally get Streets of Rage on the development schedule. It took a while to get it, but I think we can all agree that it was definitely worth the wait. The Streets of Rage series is a true Sega classic.
Game collecting. I bloody love game collecting. But how do you guys actually show off your collection? Do you do it by release order, alphabetically, or was you like me and decided to put them into code order? Until you realised that wasn't gonna work. And why is that? Well, as you can see here, we have them in alphabetical order. This is my very small Mega Drive Japanese collection. You've got Aladdin at the very beginning, all the way up to Wrestle War at the end. and the reason I don't put them in code order is because it messes with my OCD. Allow me to demonstrate. G4001 is Altered Beast, G4002 is Space Harrier 2, G4003 is Super Thunderblade, G4004 is Alex Kidd and the Enchanted Castle, G4005 is this, G4006 is Super League Baseball. There's a reason I've got this one. You'll see soon, you'll see soon. But when you try and get your hands on a copy of G4007, it's not impossible, but it's practically impossible. It's such a hard game to find that at one point even Sega denied its existence. But it does indeed exist, because inside Super League Baseball, if we open up the manual, you will see right at the end upcoming games such as Space Harrier 2, Super Thunderblade, Altered Beast, that one I couldn't pronounce earlier, Alex Kidd and the Enchanted Castle, Phantasy Star 2, which actually came out one day before this one, and the upcoming game Tetris. Let's find out exactly what happened. Here it is, folks, proof that Tetris does indeed exist, or at least did to a degree. But why all of the secrecy, Sega? Why do less than 10 but more than 5 copies of this game exist nowadays? It's just Tetris, and not the greatest Tetris either. Well, that's what we're going to discuss today. Hi everybody, I'm DJ Slope from Slope's Game Room, and this is the story of Mega Drive's rarest game, Tetris. Tetris didn't start on the Mega Drive, far from it. If we're going to go back to the beginning, then we really need to look at the 1984 version built for Russian Electronica 60 terminals. It was created by Alexei Pajunov, and although I don't plan to take on the gaming historian today, what I will say is that this game became quite important. I mean, obviously it did. Tetris was huge, and only a few years later the first commercially released titles by Microsoft under the license of Andromeda came out, and Sega came in only 1 year after this in 1998 with their first version called Tetris, but for the arcades. Now, the whole Microsoft thing was a mix-up from the get-go. Robert Stein of Andromeda had secured the rights, or at least he had believed he secured the rights, after making a deal with Pajunov and the Soviet Academy, where he created the game directly. He then went to Microsoft, who went ahead and accepted his offer to release it. This all went skew with, however, when ELOG, the Soviet Ministry of Software, got involved and put one of those annoying L-shaped pieces into the works, stating that they wasn't included in the trade deal, and poor old Robert Stein had to renegotiate, which he did, and thankfully for him he got the rights approved for the home computer ports. Now, from here we get the console versions, and that's when Atari came in. Atari was contracted by Microsoft and the deal was signed. But Microsoft also didn't own the rights, even though they believed that they did. Regardless, this rabbit hole just gets deeper and deeper, with quite a few different companies trying to grab a piece of the action, and ELOG running round trying to clean up the mess. Again, I highly suggest looking into the deep dive that Norm, the gaming historian, put out not that long ago. It's seriously a brilliant watch. But for now, all you need to know is that Atari didn't just attempt to release Tetris for the NES under their 10-gen brand before the mighty suits at Nintendo stepped in to put a stop to that, but they did actually release the arcade version as an upgrade kit, but only in Western territories. As for Japan, well, those rights were handed over to Sega, and here we are. 2 versions of the same game released for the arcades by 2 different companies. So, as you can see, both versions actually look quite a bit different. Atari's version is set up for you to clear a certain amount of blocks before moving on to the next stage, where you need to remove more and more, getting faster and harder. It also doesn't have the ability to shoot your bricks down after pressing up, and you can't slide your bricks around when they land, but most importantly for this version is the ability to take on your opponent in a 2-player mode. As far as Tetris games go, you could do a lot worse. It's a pretty solid game. And as for Sega's rendition, well, it's not too different. You only have one directional spin sadly, but you do have the ability to speed up the descent by pressing down on the joypad. Something that many believe is actually better than the sudden placement by pressing up, as this way you're not going to accidentally place your bricks in the wrong place. Also, something that's very 80s arcade-like is the pictures taken from around the world in the background. Every time you go up a level, the background changes, similar I suppose to, I don't know, the awesome Luminaires games. The music isn't your standard Tetris music, but it's pretty good, and fun fact, one of those tunes even ended up in the Master System version of Columns. Oh, and one final thing, when left alone and the game went into attract mode, you actually saw the game's sort of mascot, a monkey. This game came out in 1988 in Japan, and being that it was Japan, and you know the incredibly addictive gameplay that is Tetris, arcade goers became quite interested in this cabinet, and it did very, very well. Hang on a minute. 1988? Isn't that the exact same year that the Mega Drive was released? Why, yes it was! And with Sega being Sega, they decided to port this, yet another arcade game, to the system. And voila! Tetris for the Mega Drive was released at some point in 1989. And just like Tengen's attempt to bring their version of Tetris to the NES, Sega was also stopped dead in their tracks, and it's believed that less than 10 copies exist, making it the rarest Mega Drive game ever released, with one signed copy reportedly being sold for $1 million. Obviously, with this simply being a Tetris game, it actually doesn't play that much different to the arcade. However, for the absolute closest version, you will actually need to go get yourself the MegaTech system release, which basically is, yet again, exactly the same, and Sega got away with this as they still had the authorization to release Tetris arcade games. And that is why this game is so incredibly rare. The more you know, right? The whole Sega ignoring its existence makes a lot more sense now, and as the years went on, Tetris became a huge staple for Nintendo, being literally the perfect game for the Game Boy. And Steve Hanawa, who was responsible for showing Tetris to Sega, ended up discovering Columns, and on the home consoles at least, Sega became known for the jewel-destroying 3-em-up instead. However, in the arcades, yep, Sega owned Tetris. Anyway, I suppose that's the end of Tetris for Sega, right? No. This is volume 28 of the Sega Ages 2500 line, and it officially includes not only the original arcade, but also the Mega Drive ROM too. But that's still not all. The Tetris company, not long after the release of the Mega Drive game, put in some ground rules for future Tetris games, and this version also includes a slight reimagining of the original with these updates included. But on top of that, you also got the Sega System E hardware version, yet another arcade port, and the arcade and unreleased Mega Drive version of another Tetris ripoff called Flashpoint, and yet another 3 arcade ports of another Tetris ripoff called Blockseed. Talk about milking the Tetris cow, right? Sega had the rights and they bloody made sure that they used them. In Flashpoint, instead of removing as many lines as possible, you need to remove certain flashing blocks instead, and in Blockseed you essentially play Tetris with power-ups included to mix up the gameplay. So there you have it, guys. Tetris, the game that Sega didn't want you to know existed until they was ready to let you know that it existed. It does indeed exist, and it's the reason I'm never going to put my games in code order. No. Well, that is unless I become extremely rich, or I buy a reproduction, of course. And by the way, guys, G4008, that doesn't exist either, but more on that another time. can you not love this amazing company? So many brilliantly published and developed games. Sure, they died down a bit when they left the hardware business, but still, they have such an amazing set of IPs. There's just so many of them that sadly have been left dormant, and what we really want to see is a sequel to, well, pretty much anything. Now sure, we recently got the amazing Sonic game and that awesome new Puyo Puyo game, which by the way I'm pretty much obsessed with. But what about Streets of Rage? What about Jet Set Radio? Who's up for Vector Man? Alex Kidd anyone? The list is endless. You gotta give it to companies like Nintendo. Whether you remember the classic games or not, that company will make sure that you somehow remember these games even if you've never played them before. And you know what? Fair play to them. The same goes for us YouTube nostalgia injected channel owners too. Bring up a game like this and before long everyone and their mother's hedgehog will be buying a complete in-box graded copy of the game, boosting up the prices to ridiculous levels because the audience somehow feel nostalgic about a game that they never owned, and in some cases never even played. Which is surely the case when it comes down to games like Rystar. Yep, this game didn't sell that well back in the day. In fact, it sold quite badly. I remember it being plastered all over my SEGA magazines, but just like everyone else, even with the game's good scores, for whatever reason, it just didn't intrigue me enough to actually spend my pocket money on it. However, nowadays, for us retro gaming whores, it's an absolute classic that stands shoulder to shoulder amongst the system's very best selling and rated games. So, let's finally cut the nostalgia crap, shall we? And look into exactly why Rystar is such a good game that deserves all of the praise that it eventually got. Because we're going to be looking into the game's development, its histories, its cameos, and of course, the game itself. Welcome to Slope's Game Room. Come on, I love me some classic Sega. It was only a matter of time before I gave the complete history spotlight to this bad boy. Oh yes, for today's episode we're looking at the weird video game character that looks like a cross between the blue spiny mammal and that overweight star from the Care Bears cartoons of the 90s. Like I already said, he, I assume it's a he, has become a pretty big icon in the video game world. And even though Sega are definitely never going to make another Rystar game, as stated by the lead designer Akira Nishino.
Will Rystar come back? No, probably not. Of course, as a game developer, I would love to see it happen. At the time of the original, I was thinking of a sequel. It got as far as a character design for that sequel, but it didn't happen for various reasons.
We can all dream, right? But hold up. Rystar sequels that the fans would love and would probably sell pretty damn well, but are never gonna happen. Oh no. I think we're in fact getting a little ahead of ourselves. So, let's go back to the beginning. Back in the day before Rystar the Shooting Star and even before Sonic the Bloody Hedgehog, Sega, looking to take a piece of the Fat Plumber's success, decided enough was enough. We need to get ourselves a brand new mascot that's going to go head to head with Mario and co. Now I will one day create a complete history of Sonic the Hedgehog. I'm serious, I will do it one day. So for now, I'm not going to go into the full process of how his design changed significantly from concept to reality, due to the friction caused between Sega of America and Sega of Japan. No. For this episode, all you need to know is that Sonic was not the first design that popped up. And to be fair, it wasn't Rystar either. To tackle everything red, Sega decided to hold a little internal competition to create a mascot that would show off the Mega Drive and get it onto the radar of kids worldwide. No pressure. Well, several characters were put up to the task, pretty much all of which have never been seen by us retro-loving fans. However, one of the designs was this. Not a hedgehog, not a star, a rabbit. The gimmick, The ability that the new nameless mascot would actually have is focused on the ears. Apparently the small mammal would use its ears to grab and throw objects to defeat enemies. It's a pretty cool concept, and you can see the early design choices here most definitely made their way to both Sonic the Hedgehog and Rystar. Now obviously this didn't happen, and what we got instead was a mascot that was far more appealing for the newly released Black Beast that had such amazing speed and control it dropped the jaw of all who saw it. Obviously, this was an amazing smart move for Sega. However, sadly, the rabbit concept never got any further than this simple drawing. So, after the world went batshit crazy for Sonic the Hedgehog during the Mega Drive's lifespan, in 1995 with the new Sega Saturn on the horizon, people started to lose interest in the 16-bit generation. And although we started seeing some incredibly impressive games on all systems at this point, Sega also decided to go batshit crazy themselves, not only by releasing a new add-on every 5 minutes, but also by greenlighting the revival of the Rabbit for a system that was on its last legs, instead of doing what they should have done, and got the Sonic ball rolling on a proper Sonic the Hedgehog game for the Sega Saturn. It's easy to see in hindsight what went wrong, but as a retro gamer nowadays, it's actually quite an awesome love story and actually reminds me of Walt Disney losing the rights to his Rabbit creation and ended up creating the almighty Mickey Mouse. Now obviously this isn't what we got, but like I said, it's easy to see the inspiration. But going back ever so slightly before we got Rystar, looking into old magazine scans and early development ROMs show that the character was actually changed up quite a bit. Firstly, looking at the scans here, which are taken by the awesome Rystar cluster website, you can see he wasn't actually a star. Who knows what this is? And obviously he wasn't called Rystar either, but instead Phil. Huh, makes sense. A few screenshots are also grabbed that show off a few slight variations to the final game, but more importantly, we do get a very blurry rough look at what Phil was gonna look like in the game. The only thing left over on the cartridge from the Phil days, however, is a couple of tiny sprites used in the corner of the game that when zoomed in, look like this. Now there are quite a few prototypes of this game lurking about, and honestly I could go into every minute detail, but that wouldn't be very interesting. Go check the previously mentioned website if you want to go find them out. But for the making of section of this video, there are a few changes found throughout that are definitely worth mentioning. Like for instance, the final 3 lines in memory for the ending sequence read, "Caution, Rystar is not Volt." What's Volt, I hear you ask? Well, it's believed by many to be yet another possible name for the yellow character that could have even outdated Phil, which may explain the lightning shoes he wears in the final version. But then again, that doesn't really explain the Sonic looking shoes that you can see in the Phil screenshots. Other than this, you've got a crazy amount of unused sprites, levels and sound effects, a few of which actually come from Sonic 3. And out of all of these prototypes, there is one that has a completely different title screen, giving the character a 4th, although probably not final name, Dexstar. Oh my god. What was Sega doing with this rabbit turned upside down, David Draymond's chin looking eventual star of a video game character that again was released during the late days of the system's life? Well, I bet Sonic Team don't even have the answer to that one. Either way, the game was finally released in North America first on February 16th, 1995, followed by Japan, Europe and then Australia. And well, I think it's time we finally look at what they created. You know those people that say Sonic is just hold right and jump when you stop running? Well, obviously that's bogus. Any decent player of the games will back this up. However, if you are one of these people, then I suggest checking out Rystar. Not only does it use the same engine as Sonic 1, but the lead guy, Akira Nishino, also worked on Sonic CD. And before even playing, you can surely see the similarities. But the main difference with this game over the similar looking Sonic the Hedgehog games is that this is far more of a slower and at this point in gaming a far more interesting and fresh platformer. The story goes that this evil space pirate douche named Greedy from the Valdi system is using his mind control techniques to take over loads of planet leaders in an attempt to get them to obey him. Now, this is where it gets a little different depending on which version you get. In the Japan release, the inhabitants of planet Nier pray for a hero to stop this from happening, and the prayers ended up reaching a star goddess who awakens one of her children, who just so happens to be Rystar, to save the day. Now in the English release, Rystar's dad gets kidnapped by Greedy, which gives Rystar all the encouragement he needs to save the day and his dad. I quite like that both versions have different stories myself, and due to playing the English one more, I'm going to say that that's my favourite out of the two, so we're just going to go with that one. Rystar is quite a simple to play game. Even with the Mega Drive's 3-button controller, there really is only 2 moves you need to use. You got jump and you got grab. Like I said, with only 2 main controls, it's pretty simple, but just like all good platformers, the amount of things you can do with those 2 actions is quite impressive. The team wanted to make it so that you could grab hold of everything you see, which is why they modelled the design of Rystar on a small child, because, you know, kids literally love to touch, or should I say feel, everything. And with that in mind, they pretty much nailed it. Sure, by today's standards you're really not grabbing much more than what you need to, but comparing this to other games at the time, it was quite unique. You can use your arms to pull yourself up lifts, ladders, spin on those little handles, defeat enemies, and heck, even grab hold of some enemies and use them to move on in the game. It's quite ingenious, one simple mechanic used again and again in a gorgeous looking world. And as this is not about the speed, but instead the chilled out exploring of it all, what you got is a game that, other than the look of it all, is actually nothing like the game it's always being compared to. Every level looks stunning in Rystar, and very different from the last. Rystar always looks and feels like it can interact with each one brilliantly, and overall the game is just great fun to play. Look, even Rystar looks like he's enjoying himself. Well, in the Japanese version at least. In the English version, however, not so much. As usual, the game is available anywhere and everywhere, so if you don't want to pay the inflated original prices that just keeps getting higher and higher every time someone like me makes a Rystar video, then my suggestion is to just spend £1 or £2 on getting an emulated version, and in fact, the Steam release is a bloody good version of the game. Now, as you may know, Rystar didn't just make its way on the Mega Drive at the arse end of its life, it also messed about on the Game Gear too, and this version is bloody fantastic. You know, for a Game Gear port of a Mega Drive game, that is. Why would you ever choose this over the original? Well, you wouldn't. But back in the day, if you didn't own a Mega Drive, then the Game Gear version is a great port of an already brilliant game. There really isn't much else to say about this port, it's just a really good Game Gear game. Go play it if you really, really want more Rystar in your life. Otherwise, just pick this one up instead. So, what's next for Rystar? Well, nothing. Even though the original was a brilliant game with good reviews and a loyal fan base behind it, like I said, it came out way too late for both systems, and because of this, there was hardly any marketing for the game at all. And this is why I perhaps passed it up. I remember one of the very final Sega magazines I picked up did a feature of the yellow star on the front cover. But to fill up the rest of the ever-decreasing pages of the Sega magazine, it spent a lot of time talking about the Sega Saturn, which was already out in Japan. As a young lad, it was hard to get excited for yet another platformer. Heck, that's all I've been playing on my Mega Drive, bar a couple of releases up to this point. And although I do remember seeing Rystar in the shops, it wasn't long after that I got my PlayStation, leaving the world of Sega well behind. Now obviously poor old Rystar did in fact build up that cult fan base many years later. And although, like I said, we are never going to get that awesome sequel that we so desire, that was apparently going to expand the Rystar universe with extra characters that use their legs, body and hair to perform special abilities, he has made the odd cameo. You got him popping up in Shenmue, you can see him in the intro for Sega Gaga, and of course another nice 3D model of Rystar can be seen in the downloadable track Egg Hanger for the original Sega All-Star Racing, and at the beginning of every track in its sequel, Sonic and All-Star Racing Transformed. And it's all because of this originally forgotten Mega Drive classic. Rystar, it's taken a while, but you're finally here in the winner's circle of classic Sega titles. That original game is one of the most Mega Drive looking games ever made, apart from Sonic the Hedgehog 3 and Knuckles of course. And if you ask me, no matter what console you collect for, this game is fully worth checking out. Which finally brings this complete history episode to a close. Now as usual, when I end one of these videos spewing out my theories on the future of another forgotten Sega mascot, all I can hope for is that Sega continue to show off their brilliant history. Heck, it worked for Sonic Mania and the crowd went wild for Shenmue 3, so you never know. I mean come on, Rystar uses the Sonic engine, so why not make a sequel? Look, whatever the Big Blue decide to do, let's all just hope that they continue to showcase this amazing character in future releases.